She carried a wounded child to his gate, blood staining her torn dress, desperation carved into every line of her face. Apache warrior Cochise thought his son had died in the cavalry raid 2 winters ago. But when the boy whispered his name through fevered lips, a heart that had turned to stone began to beat again. Eagle's Rest Canyon, Arizona Territory, autumn of 1885. The wind swept through red sandstone walls like the breath of ancient spirits, carrying the scent of sage and the memory of battles fought in shadows and silence. Here, where the Apache had once made their stronghold, where warriors had trained their sons to read the language of stone and sky, now only one man remained. Cochise, wind-driven, sat motionless on the rim of the canyon, his weathered hands resting on the stock of his Winchester rifle.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
42 years old, with silver threading through his black hair and scars, mapping the history of 100 fights across his chest and arms. His face, carved from the same red stone as the canyon walls, showed no expression as he watched the desert floor far below. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days had passed since the cavalry came. Since Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's men had swept down on the hidden Apache camp at dawn, sabers flashing in the early light, rifles cracking like thunder in the sacred silence. Cochise had been hunting with his son that morning, tracking elk in the high country, teaching 8-year-old Running Wolf the old ways of reading sign and moving like shadow through the pine forests. They had returned to find smoke rising from their world, bodies scattered like broken dolls among the burning wickiups. Women, children, elders, all of them gone in the space of a sunrise. And among the dead, his wife Morning Star, who had tried to shield the youngest children with her own body. Her blood had painted the earth beneath the cottonwood where they had been married 10 summers before. But it was not finding his wife's body that broke Cochise's spirit. It was not finding his son's. Running Wolf had vanished without a trace, no blood trail, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle. Just gone, as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. The other children's bodies lay where they had fallen, but Running Wolf existed only in the terrible space between hope and despair. For 3 weeks, Cochise had tracked every possible sign. He had followed cavalry hoofprints for 100 miles. Had crept close enough to their camps to count their sleeping faces, had searched every cave and canyon where a frightened child might hide. He had spoken to traders and missionaries, to Mexican vaqueros and buffalo soldiers, to anyone who might have seen a small Apache boy with intelligent dark eyes and a scar shaped like a crescent moon on his left shoulder. No one had seen Running Wolf. No one knew where the children had gone. And slowly, like a man bleeding to death from a wound he could not find, Cochise began to accept what his warrior's heart refused to believe. That his son was dead, that the cavalry had taken even the small bodies as trophies, that everything worth protecting in this world had been stripped away in a single morning of violence. After the burial rituals, after the mourning songs had been sung and the sacred smoke had carried his prayers to the spirit world, Cochise had walked away from what remained of his people. The surviving Apache had scattered to other bands, other reservations, other ways of living that did not include the memory of Eagle's Rest Canyon. But Cochise could not leave. He had built his solitude like a fortress, stone by stone, silence by silence. The abandoned Apache camp became his domain, the sacred canyon his prison and his sanctuary. He spoke to no one except the spirits of the dead, acknowledging visitors only when they posed a direct threat to his chosen isolation. Travelers learned to avoid Eagle's Rest Canyon, to take the longer path around the red walls rather than risk an encounter with the Apache who had forgotten how to be human. The wickiup where he had raised Running Wolf stood empty, exactly as it had been the morning they left to hunt. His son's bow, child-sized and perfectly crafted, hung from its peg beside the door. A pair of moccasins, outgrown but never discarded, sat by the cold fire pit. Cochise had touched nothing, changed nothing, as if preserving the physical remnants of his former life might somehow call back the spirits of those he had lost. Each dawn, he climbed to the canyon rim and watched the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Each sunset, he descended to the valley floor and walked among the ruins of his people's final home. Between these rituals, he existed in the gray space of survival, hunting only enough to keep his body functioning, maintaining his weapons only. Because a warrior's habits died harder than a warrior's heart, moving through each day like a man performing ceremonies for gods who had stopped listening. The reservation agents had stopped coming after the first year. They had offered him land, rations, the chance to start over among the scattered remnants of the Apache nation. Cochise had listened to their words with the patience of stone, then watched them ride away without speaking a single word in response. What use did a dead man have for the gifts of the living? But the canyon remembered everything. In the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, he heard morning stars' laughter. In the cry of hawks circling overhead, he heard running wolves. Voice calling from the high places where they had hunted together. The spirits of Eagle's Rest Canyon held him like a gentle trap, keeping him alive when death would have been a mercy, keeping him hoping when hope was just another word for suffering. October 15th, 1885. The day began like any other in Cochise's carefully constructed routine of grief and solitude. He rose before dawn, climbed to his watching place on the canyon rim, and settled into the meditation that passed for prayer in his diminished world. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in the subtle colors of early autumn. Sage green and rust red, the gold of dying grass and the purple shadows that pooled in distant arroyos. But something was different about this morning. Storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, building into towering thunderheads that promised the kind of desert cloudburst that could turn dry washes into raging torrents in minutes. The air carried the electric tension that came before lightning, and the wildlife grew restless. Coyotes calling to each other across impossible distances, hawks riding the thermals in agitated circles, even the desert mice scurrying for higher ground. Cochise watched the approaching storm with the detached interest of a man who had weathered far worse tempests than anything nature could devise. Rain would be welcome. The water barrels were running low, and the spring that fed the canyon had diminished to a trickle during the dry months. But storms also brought travelers, people seeking shelter who might stumble upon his sanctuary and disturb the carefully maintained balance of his solitude. By midday, the first raindrops were falling, fat and warm and carrying the scent of distant places. Cochise descended from his watching post and began the practical preparations for a desert storm. Securing loose objects, checking the drainage channels he had dug around his camp, ensuring that his weapons and ammunition remained dry. The ancient Apache camp had been built with such storms in mind, positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and elevated enough to avoid flash flooding. The storm struck at full force just after the sun reached its zenith. Rain fell in sheets so dense that visibility dropped to mere yards. Thunder rolled through the canyon like the voices of angry gods, and lightning turned the red sandstone walls into brief, brilliant sculptures of silver fire. Cochise took shelter in his wickiup, listening to the elemental fury with the calm acceptance of a man who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to him. That was when he heard the voice. At first, it was just another sound lost in the storms. Chaos. Wind through the cottonwoods, rain on stone, the distant rumble of water rushing through normally dry channels. But gradually, persistence made it distinct from the natural symphony. A human voice, calling out in English, high and desperate, and definitely female. Cochise moved to the entrance of his wickiup and peered through the rain-soaked twilight of the storm.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Lightning flashed, illuminating the canyon floor in stark black and white, and for an instant he saw them. Two figures struggling through the downpour, one supporting the other, both moving with the desperate determination of people who understood. That shelter meant the difference between life and death. The larger figure was a woman, her long dark hair plastered to her skull by the rain, her clothes torn and mud-stained. She wore the practical dress of a frontier woman. Dark wool skirt, white blouse, sturdy boots. But everything was soaked through and clinging to her slender frame. In her arms, she carried a smaller figure, a child who hung limp and motionless against her chest. Another lightning flash revealed more details. The woman's face was streaked with mud and something darker that might have been blood. Her left sleeve was torn from shoulder to wrist, exposing skin that bore the parallel scratches of thorns or claws. The child in her arms appeared to be a boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, his head lolling against the woman's shoulder with the terrible stillness of unconsciousness or something worse. Cochise watched them approach his camp with the frozen attention of a man seeing ghosts walk among the living. The woman stumbled, nearly fell, caught herself and kept moving toward the cluster of abandoned wickiups that marked the heart of what had once been a thriving Apache community. She was heading directly for his shelter, guided by some instinct that recognized the signs of human habitation, even in the storm's confusion. She reached the entrance to his wickiup and stopped, swaying on her feet like a tree about to fall. Through the rain and darkness, her eyes found his. Green eyes, he noticed, with the part of his mind that still functioned analytically. Green as summer leaves and bright with desperation and exhausted determination. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "My son, he's hurt. We need help." Cochise stared at the woman and the boy she carried, his mind struggling to process the reality of their presence. For 2 years, no one had approached Eagle's Rest Canyon. The location was too remote, too associated with death and Apache resistance for casual travelers. Yet here stood a woman who had somehow found her way through the storm to his door, carrying a child who... The boy stirred in the woman's arms, and Cochise's breath caught in his throat. Even through the rain and shadows, even accounting for the changes that 2 years could bring to a growing child, the resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of the face, the set of the shoulders, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. "Please." The woman said again, and this time her voice broke. "I know you don't have any reason to help us, but he's dying." There was nowhere else to go. Without conscious decision, Cochise stepped aside and gestured them into his shelter. The woman stumbled through the entrance, water streaming from her clothes, and collapsed to her knees beside his fire pit. The boy in her arms remained motionless, his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. In the firelight, Cochise could see the extent of their ordeal. The woman's clothes were not just wet but shredded, as if she had fought her way through miles of thorny desert scrub. Her hands were cut and bleeding, her face marked with exhaustion so profound it seemed carved into her bones. But it was the boy who commanded Cochise's attention. The child appeared to be 7 or 8 years old, with the lean build and dark coloring that could mark him as Apache, Mexican, or any mixture of the bloodlines that had blended along the frontier. His clothes, denim pants and a cotton shirt, were torn and stained with mud and blood. A crude bandage around his left arm was soaked through with seepage from what appeared to be a serious wound. But it was not the boy's injuries that made Cochise's heart pound like war drums in his chest. It was the scar on the child's left shoulder, visible through a tear in his shirt. A crescent-shaped mark, pale against sun-darkened skin, exactly the size and shape of the scar his son running wolf had carried since a childhood accident with a hunting knife. "What happened to you?" Cochise asked, his voice rough from disuse and shock. The woman looked up at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "We were traveling with a wagon train from Santa Fe to Tucson. 3 days ago, we were attacked by bandits. Mexicans, I think, or maybe Americans pretending to be Mexicans. They killed the men, took the women and children. Her voice caught. We managed to escape 2 nights ago, but they're still hunting us. And my son, he was shot trying to protect me. Cochise knelt beside the unconscious boy, his hands moving with the automatic efficiency of a warrior trained in battlefield medicine. The child's pulse was weak but steady, his breathing shallow but regular. The wound in his arm was serious but not immediately life-threatening. A bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. As Cochise examined the injury, the boy's eyes fluttered open. Dark eyes, intelligent and alert despite the fever that flushed his cheeks. Eyes that looked up at Cochise with a mixture of fear and recognition that sent ice through the Apache warrior's veins. "Father?" the boy whispered in perfect Apache. "Have you come to take me home?" The world stopped. Time froze like water in a winter stream. Cochise stared down at the child who had just spoken to him in the language of his people, who had called him by the name only one person in this world had ever used. "What did you say?" Cochise's voice was barely a whisper. The boy's eyes focused with effort, looking directly into Cochise's face. "Father, it's me. It's Running Wolf. I've been trying to find you for so long, Elena." For she had given her name as Elena Varga during her desperate plea for help, stared in confusion between the Apache warrior and the boy she had been calling her son for nearly 2 years. The conversation was taking place in a language she didn't understand, but the emotional weight of it was unmistakable. Cochise's hands trembled as he reached out to touch the boy's face, his fingers tracing the familiar features that had haunted his dreams for 27 months. The shape of the eyes, the stubborn jawline, the small scar above the left eyebrow from a fall when he was 5 years old. "Running Wolf," he whispered in Apache. "My son, how is this possible?" The boy, his son who had been dead. His son who was somehow alive and lying wounded in his arms, smiled with the ghost of the bright spirit Cochise remembered. "The soldiers didn't kill me, Father. They took me to sell to the Mexican traders, but I escaped. I've been looking for you, trying to get home to Eagle's Rest Canyon." Elena watched this exchange with growing understanding and heartbreak. The man she had thought was a hostile Apache, the boy she had thought was her adopted son, the family she had believed she was building. All of it was dissolving in the firelight like smoke from wet wood. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Running Wolf, that's not his name. His name is Miguel. Miguel Santos. I adopted him from the mission inside of Faye 2 years ago. The priests said his parents were dead, that he had no family." Cochise looked at her with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and growing suspicion. This woman had cared for his son, had kept Running Wolf alive through whatever ordeal had separated them. But she had also been living a lie, calling his son by another name, raising him in another culture, keeping him from the father who had never stopped searching. "The priests lied," Cochise said, his English careful but clear. "This boy is my son. His name is Running Wolf, and he is Apache. He was taken from me during the cavalry raid on our camp 2 winters ago." Elena stared at him, then at the boy, at Running Wolf, who was looking between them with confusion and exhaustion. The family she had built, the life she had imagined, the future she had planned, all of it was crumbling around her like walls built on sand. But even as her heart broke, she could see the truth in the boy's face, in the way he looked at the Apache warrior, in the recognition that passed between them like electricity in the storm-charged air. This was not Miguel Santos, the orphaned Mexican boy she had fallen in love with. This was Running Wolf, son of Cochise, stolen from his people and sold into a lie that had lasted 2 years too long. Outside the wickiup, the storm continued to rage, rain drumming against hide walls and lightning illuminating the canyon, view crumbing against hide walls, and lightning against hide walls, and lightning illuminating the canyon in brief, brilliant flashes. But inside, in the warm circle of firelight, 3 lives balanced on the edge of transformation. A father who had mourned his son. A son who had never stopped believing he would find his way home. And a woman who was about to lose everything she had ever loved, even as she helped reunite the family that rightfully belonged together. Running Wolf's eyes closed again, exhaustion and fever pulling him back toward unconsciousness, but not before he reached out with his uninjured hand and grasped his father's fingers. "Don't leave me again, Father," he whispered in Apache. "Promise you won't leave me again." Cochise closed his eyes and felt tears he had not shed since the morning he buried his wife flow down his cheeks like rain. "Never, my son," he promised. "Never again will I let anyone take you from me." The storm raged through the night, but inside the wickiup, a different kind of tempest was settling into an uneasy calm. Cochise worked through the dark hours with the focused intensity of a warrior preparing for battle, cleaning Running Wolf's gunshot wound with boiled water and herbs his wife Morningstar had taught him to use. His hands moved with practiced precision, but his heart thundered with emotions he had buried so deep he had forgotten they existed. Elena sat in the shadows beyond the firelight, watching the Apache warrior tend to the boy she had called her son for 2 years. Every gesture spoke of intimate knowledge, of a father's practiced care that came from countless nights of tending scraped knees and fevered brows. She could see the way Running Wolf's body relaxed under his father's touch, the way his breathing deepened as if recognizing safety at a cellular level. "The bullet passed clean through," Cochise said without looking at her, his English heavily accented but clear. "No bone damage, no major vessels torn. He will heal, but he needs rest and proper food to rebuild his strength." Elena nodded, though she wasn't sure he could see her in the dim light. "He's always been strong. Stronger than other children his age. I used to wonder where that came from." "Apache children are taught to endure," Cochise replied, finally meeting her eyes across the fire. "We do not coddle our young." Running Wolf learned to bear pain before he learned to walk properly. The casual use of his son's Apache name sent a fresh wave of loss through Elena's chest. For 2 years she had called him Miguel, had built an entire identity around the sweet, quiet boy who helped her tend their small garden in Santa Fe, who learned his letters with the serious concentration of an adult, who never spoke of dreams or memories from before she found him. "Did he remember you?" she asked quietly. All this time, did he know who he really was? Cochise considered the question as he secured a fresh bandage around Running Wolf's arm. Apache children are taught to survive above all else. If forgetting his true name meant staying alive, Running Wolf would have forgotten. But the heart remembers what the mind chooses to forget. As if summoned by his father's words, Running Wolf stirred in his sleep. His fever had broken sometime during the night, and his color was better, the deadly pallor replaced by the natural bronze of his heritage. His eyes opened slowly, focusing first on Cochise's face, then shifting to Elena with an expression of confusion and something that might have been guilt. "Mother Elena," he said in Spanish, the language he had spoken exclusively for 2 years. "Are you angry with me?" Elena felt her heart crack like pottery dropped on stone. Even now, even after the miraculous reunion with his biological father, Running Wolf was worried about her feelings, concerned that he had somehow betrayed the woman who had raised him. "No, sweetheart," she said, switching to the Spanish that had become their private language. "I'm not angry. I'm happy that you found your real father." But Running Wolf shook his head, struggling to sit up despite his weakness. "You are my real mother too. You found me when I was lost. You taught me to read, to plant corn, to say prayers. You loved me when I had nightmares about the dark water." Cochise listened to this exchange in Spanish, understanding enough to follow the emotional current, even where specific words escaped him. The woman had clearly loved his son, had given him stability and affection during the years they were separated. But she had also been living with stolen goods, raising an Apache child as a Mexican peasant, keeping Running Wolf from the warrior culture that was his birthright. "The boy speaks truth," Cochise said carefully. You cared for him when I could not. This debt I acknowledge. Elena looked at him sharply. He's not a debt to be repaid. He's a child who needs love and stability. Not some prize to be won or lost. The tension in the wickiup thickened like smoke from green wood. Running Wolf looked between the two adults who had shaped his short life, sensing the undercurrents of conflict even as he struggled to understand his place in this impossible situation. I want to stay with both of you, he said finally, his voice small but determined. Father, I missed you every day, even when I couldn't remember your face. But Mother Elena saved me. She made me feel safe when everything was frightening and strange. As dawn broke over Eagle's Rest Canyon, painting the red sandstone walls in shades of gold and amber, the storm's fury finally exhausted itself. Cochise emerged from the wickiup to assess the damage and found the desert transformed. Arroyos that had been bone dry for months now ran with muddy water. Plants that had been dormant suddenly showed signs of green life. The air smelled of wet earth and growing things, but the physical renewal around him only emphasized the emotional devastation in his heart. For 2 years, he had mourned his son as dead, had built his entire existence around the reality of that loss. Now Running Wolf was alive, breathing, real, but he was also a stranger who spoke Spanish as easily as Apache, who called another woman mother, who carried the cultural markers of a life Cochise had no part in creating. Elena joined him outside, her clothes now dry but still bearing the tears and stains of their desperate flight through the desert. In daylight, Cochise could see that she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 25, with the kind of practical beauty that came from hard work and genuine kindness. Her hands bore the calluses of someone who labored for her living, and her eyes held the steady intelligence of a woman who had learned to solve problems rather than wait for others to solve them. He needs medical attention, she said without preamble. The wound is clean, but he's lost a lot of blood. And there might be other injuries from the bandit attack that we haven't discovered yet. Cochise nodded. The nearest town is Tucson, 2 days' ride south. But Apache are not welcome there, especially not Apache carrying weapons. Then I'll take him. I have papers showing he's my adopted son. The authorities will listen to me. The casual assumption that she would simply take Running Wolf and leave struck Cochise like a physical blow. You would steal him from me again. Elena's green eyes flashed. Steal him? I saved his life. When the mission priests found him half dead from starvation and exposure, I was the one who nursed him back to health. I was the one who sat beside his bed for 3 weeks while he fought fever and infection. I was the one who held him when he screamed from nightmares about drowning and burning buildings. Nightmares about the cavalry raid on our camp, Cochise said grimly. Nightmares about watching his mother die, about being torn from everything he knew and loved. Yes, exactly. And where were you when he needed comfort from those nightmares? Where were you when he was learning to trust again? Learning to believe that someone could love him without hurting him? The accusation hit its mark. Cochise had been wallowing in his own grief, building monuments to his sorrow while his son struggled to survive among strangers. He had given up hope when hope was the one thing Running Wolf needed from him. But before he could respond, Running Wolf himself appeared in the entrance to the wickiup, pale and shaky but determined to stand on his own feet. He had understood enough of their argument to grasp the central conflict, and his young face bore an expression of resolve that reminded Cochise powerfully of Morning Star. Stop fighting about me, Running Wolf said in English, the language that allowed both adults to understand him. I am not a possession to be owned. I am a person who loves both of you. Elena and Cochise stared at the 8-year-old boy who had just spoken with the wisdom of an elder. In that moment, both adults recognized the truth they had been avoiding. Running Wolf had grown during his 2 years away from his birth family. He had learned to navigate between cultures, to find strength in adaptation rather than rigid tradition. You're right, Elena said quietly. We're being selfish, thinking about what we want instead of what you need. Cochise felt shame burn in his chest like swallowed fire. His son had just taught him a lesson in wisdom that his own pride had blinded him to. Running Wolf speaks with the voice of his ancestors, he said formally. I will listen, Running Wolf smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Cochise had seen on his face since the reunion. Good, because I have been thinking about this all night, and I know what I want. What Running Wolf wanted, it turned out, was revolutionary by any cultural standard. He wanted to live with both his father and Elena, to learn the Apache ways while maintaining the skills and knowledge he had gained in the Mexican world, to be both Running Wolf and Miguel, depending on the situation and the company. In the Apache way, children belong to their mother's clan. Running Wolf explained with the serious air of a boy who had thought deeply about complex issues. But Mother Elena is not Apache, so she has no clan. This means I must create a new way of belonging. Elena listened to this 8-year-old's analysis of kinship structures with amazement. The boy she had raised as a simple farmer's son was revealing depths of understanding that spoke to his Apache heritage, his natural intelligence, and the bicultural experience that had shaped him. What are you proposing? Cochise asked, genuinely curious about his son's solution to an unprecedented problem. I want Mother Elena to become Apache, Running Wolf said simply. Not by blood, but by choice. I want her to live here in the canyon and learn our ways, while I learn to be a warrior like you. And when I am grown, I will protect both of you. The silence that followed this declaration was profound. Elena stared at the boy with shock, while Cochise considered the implications of what his son was suggesting. Apache culture was not typically open to outsiders, especially not white women who had no connection to the tribe. But Running Wolf was proposing something unprecedented, a voluntary adoption that would create new kinds of family bonds. The canyon is no place for a woman alone, Cochise said finally. It is isolated, dangerous. There are no other women. Here, no community, no support if something goes wrong. Then we make community, Elena said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation. I've been taking care of myself since I was 16 years old. Cochise studied her face, looking for signs of romantic fantasy or naive optimism. Instead, he saw the same practical determination that had driven her to adopt an unknown child, the same courage that had sustained her through bandit attacks and desert storms. You would give up the Mexican world? The church, the town, the life you built in Santa Fe. Elena looked at Running Wolf, who was watching her with hope and fear warring in his dark eyes. I would give up anything to keep him safe and happy. If that means learning to live like an Apache, then that's what I'll do. Running Wolf's face lit up with joy. But Cochise raised a cautioning hand. This is not a decision to make lightly. Apache life is hard, especially for women. You would be expected to master skills you have never needed, to live by customs that may seem strange or harsh. Teach me, Elena said simply. If Running Wolf can learn to live in two worlds, I can learn to live in one new one. What followed was the strangest courtship in the history of the American Southwest. Not a romantic courtship, but something more complex, the careful negotiation of a family structure that had no precedent in Apache or Mexican culture. Elena was not seeking the husband, and Cochise was not seeking a wife. Both were seeking the best possible future for Running Wolf, who had made it clear that his happiness depended on keeping both his parents in his life. The first test came sooner than any of them expected. On the second day after the storm, as Running Wolf's strength began to return and Elena started learning the basics of wickiup maintenance, riders appeared on the canyon rim. 3 men on horseback, heavily armed, scanning the desert floor with the focused attention of hunters tracking prey. Bandits, Elena breathed, recognizing the leader even at a distance. They followed our trail from the arroyo, Cochise moved with the fluid speed of a warrior, gathering his weapons and assessing tactical positions. The canyon offered good defensive terrain, but only if the defenders knew how to use it properly. Elena was a liability in a fight, and Running Wolf was too weak to run far if retreat became necessary. "Can you shoot?" Cochise asked Elena tersely. "Yes, but not well. I can hit a rabbit at close range, maybe. Stay with Running Wolf. If I fall, take him deeper into the canyon. There are caves where you can hide until they give up the search, but Running Wolf had other ideas. Despite his weakness, he struggled to his feet and moved to his father's weapons cache. His small hands closed around a bow that Cochise recognized, the child-sized weapon he had crafted for his son's 7th birthday, left untouched since the morning of the cavalry raid. "I can shoot," Running Wolf said quietly. "Mother Elena taught me to hunt rabbits and prairie dogs. And before that, you taught me to aim for the heart." Elena stared at the boy she thought she knew, seeing clearly for the first time the warrior heritage that ran in his blood. This was not the gentle farm child she had raised, but the son of a fighting man, trained from birth to defend his family and his people. The bandits were descending into the canyon now, their horses picking their way carefully down the rocky trail. Cochise counted 3 men, all armed with rifles, all bearing the hard look of professional killers. They moved with the confidence of people who had never encountered serious resistance from their victims. "They expect us to run or surrender," Cochise said, his voice dropping to the battle calm that had served him through a dozen skirmishes. "We will give them a different lesson." What followed was brief, violent, and decisive. The bandits had expected to find a terrified woman and a wounded child hiding in primitive shelters. Instead, they encountered an Apache warrior fighting on his home ground, supported by a determined woman and a boy who had inherited his father's deadly accuracy with a bow. Elena's first shot missed entirely, but her second took down one of the horses, pinning its rider beneath its thrashing body. Running Wolf's arrow found the throat of the bandit leader, dropping him from his saddle with a gurgling scream. And Cochise's rifle spoke 3 times in rapid succession, each shot finding its mark with the precision that had made him feared throughout the territory. When the gun smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead in the red sand of Eagle's Rest Canyon. Elena stood shaking beside the wickiup, her smoking rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. Running Wolf lowered his bow and walked calmly to retrieve his arrow, as if this were simply another hunting expedition. And Cochise surveyed the battlefield with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully defended his home and family. "You did well," he told Elena, whose face was pale with shock and adrenaline. "For someone who claims to shoot poorly, your aim improved quickly under pressure." Elena looked at the dead bandit whose horse she had brought down, then at Running Wolf, who was cleaning blood from his arrowhead with professional efficiency. "What have I gotten myself into?" She whispered. "You have gotten yourself into an Apache family," Cochise replied. "We do not die easily, and we do not let others hurt what belongs to us." Running Wolf looked up from his arrow maintenance and smiled at both adults. "See? I told you we could be a family. We protect each other." That evening, as they dragged the bodies of their attackers away from the camp and redistributed their weapons and supplies, Cochise made a decision that surprised even himself. If Elena was truly committed to becoming part of their family, if she was willing to fight and kill to protect Running Wolf, then she deserved the formal recognition that Apache culture reserved for true members of the tribe. "There is a ceremony," he told her as they sat around the fire, sharing a meal of rabbit stew and corn cakes. "A ritual of adoption for those who choose to join our people. It is not often used, but it exists." Elena looked up from her food, hope and apprehension warring in her green eyes. "What does it involve?" "Pain," Cochise said bluntly. "Sacrifice. The demonstration of commitment that cannot be faked or abandoned when life becomes difficult. And after, if you survive and prove worthy, you become truly Apache. Not by blood, but by choice and courage." Running Wolf leaned forward eagerly. Will she get an Apache name? Will she be part of our clan? If she proves herself, she will become Sister Who Chose Us, Cochise said, the formal name coming to him as if whispered by the spirits of his ancestors. And she will be mother to all Apache children who have no other mother. Elena felt tears prick her eyes at the beauty and significance of the name. To be chosen, to belong somewhere not by accident of birth but by deliberate decision, was more than she had ever dared hope for. When? She asked simply, tomorrow, when the sun reaches its highest point. The spirits will be watching, and they will judge whether your heart is truly Apache or merely pretending. That night, as Elena lay on her blanket staring up at the stars, visible through the smoke hole of the wickiup, she considered the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. She would be leaving behind everything familiar, everything safe, everything she had built in her former life. In return, she would gain a family, a culture, identity forged in fire and sealed with blood. Beside her, Running Wolf slept peacefully. For the first time since the bandit attack, his body relaxed in the security of knowing that both his parents were nearby and committed to protecting him. And across the fire, Cochise sat in meditation, preparing his spirit for the ceremony that would either welcome a new sister into the Kulfar Apache nation or reveal that some bonds could not be forged by will alone. The canyon walls seemed to lean inward in the darkness, as if the ancient stones were listening, waiting to see whether three broken people could create something whole from the fragments of their separate sorrows. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight brought only the possibility of transformation, fragile as a flame in the desert wind. The sun rose like a copper shield over Eagle's Rest Canyon, casting long shadows between the towering sandstone walls. Elena woke before dawn, her body tense with anticipation and fear. Today she would either become Apache or die trying. There was no middle ground in the ceremony Cochise had described. She had spent the night dreaming of fire and water, of voices speaking in languages she didn't understand, of Running Wolf calling her name from across a vast desert. Cochise was already awake, sitting in perfect stillness beside the dying fire. He had painted his face with white clay and red ochre in patterns Elena didn't recognize, geometric designs that spoke of ancient traditions and sacred obligations. His long black hair was braided with feathers and small bones, and he wore only a breechcloth and moccasins, his scarred chest bare to the morning air. The spirits have been restless all night, he said without looking at her. They sense that something unprecedented is about to happen. A woman who is not Apache, who has no blood connection to our people, is asking to become one of us through ritual rather than birth. Elena felt her stomach tighten with nerves. Have you changed your mind? Do you think the spirits will reject me? I think the spirits care less about your blood than about your heart, Cochise replied. But the ceremony will test both. Are you prepared to shed your old identity completely? To let Elena Varga die so that an Apache woman can be born? The question struck deeper than Elena had expected. She had thought of the ceremony as an addition to her identity, not a replacement of it. But Cochise was asking her to undergo a kind of spiritual death, to sacrifice the person she had been for the person she might become. Running Wolf emerged from the wickiup, moving more easily now that his wound was healing. He had painted his own face with yellow and black stripes, and he carried his small bow with the confidence of a warrior despite his youth. Mother Elena, he said in Apache, using words Cochise must have taught him. Today you become my true mother in the eyes of the spirits. The weight of responsibility settled on Elena's shoulders like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about her own transformation. It was about becoming worthy of the trust a brave, intelligent boy was placing in her. Running Wolf had already lost one mother to violence. If Elena failed today, if the ceremony rejected her or she proved unworthy, he would lose another. I'm ready, she said, though her voice shook slightly. Tell me what I must do. What followed was unlike anything Elena had experienced in her Catholic upbringing. Apache ritual was raw, primal, connected to the earth and sky in ways that made church ceremonies seem pale and bloodless by comparison. Cochise led her to a natural pool fed by the canyon's hidden spring, its water so clear she could see every pebble on the bottom. "First, you must wash away who you were," Cochise instructed. "Not just your body, but your spirit. Let the water carry away Elena Varga's fears, her assumptions, her old ways of seeing the world." Elena hesitated at the water's edge. The pool was cold, fed by snowmelt from the distant mountains, and she would have to strip completely to perform the ritual cleansing properly. But modesty seemed ridiculous in the face of spiritual transformation. She undressed quickly and stepped into the pool, gasping as the icy water rose around her legs. Cochise began to chant in a language that predated Spanish and English, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to match the pulse of the earth itself. Elena submerged herself completely, letting the cold shock drive all thoughts from her mind. When she surfaced, Cochise was waiting with clay paint and brushes made from yucca fibers. "Now you become who you will be," he said, beginning to paint symbols on her face and arms. "These marks tell the spirits who you choose to become: the mother protector, the fierce defender, the woman who chose Apache life over safety and comfort." The paint felt cold against her skin, but it seemed to carry a weight beyond its physical presence. Each symbol was a commitment, a promise to live according to principles she was only beginning to understand. Elena found herself breathing differently, standing straighter, as if the painted designs were changing her from the outside in. Running. Wolf watched the preparation with solemn attention, occasionally nodding approval when Cochise completed a particularly significant symbol. "She looks like an Apache woman now," he said quietly. "But the spirits will want more than paint to believe her. The spirits will get more," Cochise replied grimly. "Much more." The actual ceremony began at high noon, when the sun stood directly overhead and shadows shrank to small pools beneath rocks and sage bushes. Cochise had prepared a sacred fire in a ring of stones, feeding it with specific woods that created different colored flames and aromatic smoke. The scent of burning cedar and sage filled the air, carrying prayers toward the cloudless sky. In the old days, this ceremony was performed by the entire tribe, Cochise explained, as he arranged ceremonial objects around the fire. "But we three are all the tribe that remains for this purpose. We must speak for all Apache people, living and dead." Elena knelt beside the fire circle, wearing only a simple doeskin dress that had belonged to Morning Star. The garment was too large for her slender frame, but it carried the spiritual weight of a warrior's wife, a mother who had died defending her children. Elena could feel the presence of the woman who had worn it before, as if Morning Star's spirit was watching to see whether this white woman was worthy of her husband's protection. "The first trial is fire," Cochise announced, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ritual. "You must reach into the flames and retrieve this." He held up a small stone medallion carved with Apache symbols, then dropped it into the heart of the fire where it glowed red-hot among the burning logs. Elena stared at the flames, understanding that this was not a test of quick reflexes, but of absolute commitment. The fire was real, the heat intense enough to cause serious burns. But backing down now would mean losing not just her own chance at belonging, but running Wolf's respect and perhaps his safety. Without hesitation, she plunged her hand into the fire. Pain exploded up her arm like lightning, but she forced herself to grope through the burning logs until her fingers closed around the heated stone. She pulled it free and held it aloft, her hand already blistering but her voice steady as she spoke the Apache words Cochise had taught her. "I choose the Apache way, whatever the cost." Cochise nodded approvingly and began applying the healing salve made from cactus pulp to her burned hand. "The spirits see your commitment," he said. But fire is only the first test. The second trial was more complex, requiring Elena to demonstrate not just courage, but skill and understanding. Cochise led her to a cliff face where Apache warriors had traditionally tested their climbing abilities. A near-vertical wall of red sandstone that rose 50 feet above the canyon floor. "You must climb to the sacred cave," Cochise pointed, to a barely visible opening high on the cliff face. "Inside, you will find tokens left by Apache women who completed this ceremony in generations past. You must add your own token and bring back proof that you reached the cave," Elena studied the cliff, her burned hand throbbing with each heartbeat. The handholds were minimal, weathered depressions in the sandstone that would challenge even an experienced climber. And the consequence of failure was not just embarrassment, but very possibly death. "What if I fall?" she asked, though she was already planning her route up the cliff face. "Then the spirits judge you unworthy," Cochise replied without emotion. And Running Wolf learns that some bonds cannot be forced, only earned. The climb was a nightmare of aching muscles and precarious handholds. Elena's burned hand made gripping the stone agony, but she forced herself upward one careful move at a time. Halfway up, she looked down and immediately regretted it. The canyon floor seemed impossibly far below, and a single slip would mean certain death. But Running Wolf's voice reached her from below, calling encouragement in both Apache and Spanish. "Climb strong, mother. I believe in you." His faith gave her strength when her own began to fail, and she pressed upward until her fingers finally grasped the edge of the sacred cave. Inside the cave, she found the promised token small objects, left by Apache women over the centuries. Carved stones, braided grass, painted pottery shards, each one representing a life transformed by ritual and commitment. Elena added her own token, a small silver cross that had belonged to her grandmother, symbolically offering her Christian. Passed to the Apache spirits, the descent was even more terrifying than the climb. But she managed it without falling, arriving at the bottom with scraped knees and trembling legs. Cochise examined the proof she brought from the cave, a fragment of ancient pottery, and nodded his approval. "The spirits accept your offering," he said formally. "But one trial remains." The final trial was the most dangerous because it required Elena to confront not physical challenges, but spiritual ones. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Cochise led her to a natural depression in the canyon floor where ancient Apache shamans had performed vision quests. "You must drink this," he said, offering her a cup made from a gourd. The liquid inside was dark and bitter-smelling, obviously some kind of plant medicine. "It will open your spirit to the voices of the ancestors. They will judge whether your heart is truly Apache or whether you are merely playing at transformation." Elena hesitated only a moment before draining the cup. The liquid tasted like earth and smoke, with an underlying bitterness that made her stomach clench. Almost immediately, she began to feel strange colors seemed more vivid. Sounds carried farther, and the boundary between her own thoughts and the world around her began to blur. "Lie down," Cochise instructed, guiding her to a bed of soft sand surrounded by painted stones. "Let the medicine carry you to the spirit world. Do not fight what you see or hear. The ancestors will test your worthiness in ways I cannot predict." What followed was the most intense experience of Elena's life. The medicine carried her consciousness far from her physical body, into a realm where time moved differently, and the spirits of the dead walked among swirling colors and impossible geometries. She found herself standing in a vast space that might have been the canyon or might have been somewhere else entirely. Before her stood a woman she recognized as Morning Star, Cochise's dead wife, beautiful and terrible in her spiritual form. Behind Morning Star were other figures, Apache women from generations past, all of whom had undergone this same ceremony, all of whom had earned the right to judge Elena's worthiness. "You seek to take my place," Morning Star said, her voice carrying the sound of wind through stone. "You seek to mother my son and share my husband's protection. Why should we allow this?" Elena found her voice in the spirit realm, though speaking required tremendous effort. "Because Running Wolf needs both parents, and Cochise needs family to heal his broken heart. I don't seek to replace you, I seek to honor your memory by protecting what you died for." The assembled spirits murmured among themselves in languages Elena couldn't understand. Then Morning Star stepped closer, her ghostly hand reaching out to touch Elena's face. "Show us your heart," she commanded. "Show us the truth of your commitment." What happened next was indescribable in ordinary language. Elena felt her spirit torn open like a book, every thought and feeling laid bare for the ancestors to examine. They saw her love for Running Wolf, genuine and fierce despite their short time together. They saw her respect for Cochise, complicated by attraction but grounded in recognition of his strength and honor. They saw her willingness to sacrifice everything familiar for the chance to belong somewhere completely. Most importantly, they saw her understanding that becoming Apache meant more than adopting customs or learning languages. It meant accepting responsibility for all Apache children, all Apache families, all the scattered remnants of a people who had been decimated by war and forced migration. "She speaks truth," Morning Star announced after what felt like hours of examination. "Her heart is open, her commitment real. But does she understand the price of belonging?" "Tell me the price," Elena said. Though she was afraid of the answer, "You will lose friends who cannot accept your choice. You will face persecution from both Apache and white communities. You will bear children who are caught between worlds, never fully accepted by either. And someday, you may be asked to die for people who are not your blood relatives." Elena considered these costs and found them acceptable. "I understand the price," she said. "I choose to pay it," Morning Star smiled, the expression transforming her ghostly features into something radiant and welcoming. "Then welcome, sister who chose us. Welcome to the Apache Nation." Elena woke as the sun touched the western rim of the canyon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The medicine was wearing off, but she could still feel the presence of the spirits who had accepted her, their approval like warm hands on her shoulders. Cochise knelt beside her, his painted face creased with concern. "What did you see?" he asked urgently. "Did the ancestors speak to you?" Elena sat up slowly, her body stiff from lying on the sand, but her spirit feeling lighter than it had in years. "They accepted me," she said simply. "Morning Star herself welcomed me to the tribe." Cochise's stern expression cracked, revealing a relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. For the first time since she had met him, Elena saw the man behind the warrior mask, someone who had been desperately lonely, who had needed family as much as Running Wolf did. "Then it is finished," he said formally. "Elena Varga is dead. In her place stands sister who chose us, Apache woman, mother to Running Wolf, protector of the people." Running Wolf, who had been waiting at the edge of the ceremonial space, ran forward and threw his arms around Elena's neck. "Now you are truly my mother," he said in Apache, his voice thick with emotion. "The spirits themselves have made it so." Elena held the boy close, feeling the truth of his words in her bones. She was no longer the woman who had fled Santa Fe with an adopted son. She was someone new, someone forged in fire and spirit. Someone who belonged to the Red Canyon and the people who called it home. As the three of them walked back to their camp, Cochise spoke quietly to Elena in English. "The ceremony is complete, but the real test begins now. Living as Apache is harder than becoming Apache." "I'm ready," Elena replied, and meant it. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and the ancient canyon walls seemed to lean inward protectively, sheltering the newest family to call Eagle's Rest home. The spirits of the ancestors watched approvingly as three people who had been strangers learned to become something more precious than blood relatives. They became chosen family, bound by ceremony and commitment rather than accident of birth. In the distance, a coyote held its evening song, and Elena found herself understanding its meaning without conscious thought. The Apache part of her spirit was awakening, connecting her to the desert and its creatures in ways she had never imagined possible. She was no longer a visitor in this land, she had become part of it, as permanent and rooted as the ancient stones themselves. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's transformation ceremony, and Eagle's Rest Canyon had settled into rhythms that none of its inhabitants could have imagined a month earlier. Elena, now calling herself by her Apache name Sister Who Chose Us in private moments, had thrown herself into learning the intricate skills of Apache survival with the intensity of someone who understood that her family's safety depended on her competence. The burned hand from her fire trial had healed into a permanent scar, a raised pattern of white tissue that she wore like a badge of honor. Cochise had taught her to read weather signs and cloud formations and wind patterns, to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, to move through the desert without leaving tracks that enemies could follow. Her soft hands had grown calloused from working hides and weaving baskets, and her pale skin had bronzed under the relentless Arizona sun. Running Wolf was thriving in ways that amazed both his parents. The quiet, sometimes withdrawn boy Elena had known in Santa Fe had blossomed into a confident young warrior who moved between his Apache and Mexican identities with fluid ease. In the mornings, he practiced with his bow under Cochise's stern instruction, learning to hit targets at distances that would challenge grown men. In the evenings, he helped Elena with domestic tasks while speaking Spanish and sharing stories from their time together before the reunion. But paradise, Elena was learning, always came with a price tag that wasn't revealed until the bill came due. The first sign of trouble arrived with the merchant traders who occasionally passed through the region on their way between Tucson and Santa Fe. Miguel Santos, a weathered Mexican who had been trading in Apache territory for 20 years, rode into the canyon with disturbing news from the outside world. "There are soldiers asking questions in Tucson," he told Cochise as they shared coffee around the morning fire. "U.S. Army, but also some Mexican federals. They say they're looking for a kidnapped woman and her son, a white woman named Elena Varga, and a Mexican boy called Miguel Santos." Elena felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she had hoped for more time to establish their new life before the old world came hunting. "What kind of questions?" Cochise asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Descriptions, mostly. The woman is said to be about 25, dark hair, green eyes, traveling with a boy around 8 years old. They're offering a reward $500 for information leading to their recovery." $500 was more money than most frontier families saw in 2 years. Elena knew that kind of reward would motivate every bounty hunter, desperate farmer, and opportunistic drifter within 100 miles to start looking for her and Running Wolf. "Who's offering the reward?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Miguel Santos studied her face with the sharp attention of a man who had survived decades of dangerous trade by reading people accurately. "The church in Santa Fe officially, but the money's coming from somewhere else, someone with deep pockets and a personal interest in finding you." Elena's blood chilled further. There was only one person with both the resources and the motivation to mount such an extensive search. Father Francisco Delgado, the priest who had arranged Running Wolf's original adoption, who had been pressuring Elena to marry him and turn over her son's education to the church. She had fled Santa Fe partly to escape his increasingly aggressive courtship, but apparently distance had only intensified his obsession. "This priest," Cochise said, reading the recognition in Elena's expression. "He is more than a religious interest in your welfare," Elena nodded grimly. "Father Delgado has been pursuing me for over a year. He claims it's for spiritual reasons to provide proper guidance for Miguel for Running Wolf. But he's made it clear that marriage to him would solve all my problems. And now you've disappeared with the boy, making him look foolish in front of his superiors," Miguel Santos observed. "A man like that won't give up easily, especially if he thinks his reputation is at stake." Running Wolf had been listening to this conversation with growing alarm. Will they take me back to the mission? Will they separate us again? No, Cochise said with quiet finality. You are Apache now, and Apache protect their own. But we must be prepared for what is coming. What was coming became clear over the next few days as more travelers brought news from the outside world. The search for Elena and Running Wolf had expanded beyond simple reward notices. Father Delgado had convinced both American and Mexican authorities that Elena was mentally unstable, possibly dangerous, and had kidnapped an innocent child for unknown purposes. He's claiming she's become an Apache woman, reported a Buffalo soldier who stopped at their camp while tracking deserters. Says she's been seen with painted face and Indian dress, probably being held against her will by hostiles. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so dangerous. Elena had indeed become an Apache woman, but by choice rather than force. Father Delgado's lies contained just enough truth to be believable to authorities who were already predisposed to think the worst of Apache white interactions. They're organizing a proper expedition, the soldier continued. 30 men, maybe 40. Mix of cavalry, Mexican federals, and civilian volunteers. They'll be here within 2 weeks, and they have Apache scouts working for them. Apache scouts. Elena felt her heart sink. Cochise could hide them from white soldiers almost indefinitely. Desert held 1,000 secrets that only native eyes could read. But Apache tracking Apache was a different matter entirely. Who leads these scouts? Cochise asked, though his expression suggested he already feared the answer. Man called Black Hawk, used to run with Geronimo before he surrendered. Now he works for the army, tracking his own people for soldier pay. Cochise's face went stone hard. Black Hawk had been his brother-in-law, married to Morning Star's sister, before choosing collaboration over resistance. The betrayal had been personal as well as political, and Elena could see that this manhunt had just become something more than a simple rescue operation. Black Hawk knows every hiding place in this territory, Cochise said quietly. He helped create most of them. If he's tracking us, we cannot simply hide and wait for them to give up. Then what do we do? Elena asked, though she was beginning to understand that their options were narrowing rapidly. We disappear, Running Wolf said suddenly. Not just hide, disappear completely. Become people who never existed. Both adults looked at the 8-year-old with surprise. But Running Wolf's suggestion carried the wisdom of someone who had already survived one complete identity change. Explain. Cochise said seriously. We leave Eagle's Rest Canyon, Running Wolf continued. We go north, into country where no one expects Apache to be. We become a Mexican family traveling to California. Elena can be my mother again, and father can be my stepfather. No one will look for Apache in a Mexican wagon train. Elena stared at her son, both sons, she realized. For Running Wolf had been calling Cochise's father in Spanish as easily as an Apache, with growing admiration. The boy was proposing they hide in plain sight, using the very cultural flexibility that made him unique. It could work, she said slowly, if we can get far enough north, before the search parties arrive. But it means abandoning everything we've built here. Everything we've built can be rebuilt, Cochise replied. Family is portable. Land is not. The decision to flee Eagle's Rest Canyon was the hardest Elena had ever made. In 3 weeks, the ancient Apache stronghold had become home in ways she hadn't expected. She knew every rock formation, every hidden spring, every place where edible plants grew. The canyon had witnessed her transformation from Elena Varga to sister who chose us, and leaving felt like abandoning part of her newly forged identity. But staying meant capture, separation, and probably death. Father Delgado had convinced the authorities that she was dangerous and unstable. Cochise would be killed as a hostile Apache. Running Wolf would be taken back to the mission, and Elena herself would likely face imprisonment or commitment to an asylum. The risks of flight paled beside the certainty of disaster if they were caught. They had 4 days to prepare before the search expedition was expected to reach their area. Cochise spent those days in intensive planning, drawing on decades of experience in evading military pursuit. They would travel light, fast, and in disguise. Elena would resume her role as a Mexican widow. Running Wolf would be her son Miguel. And Cochise would be her new husband, a vaquero named Carlos Marino. "Your Spanish is good enough to pass casual inspection," Elena told Cochise as they practiced their new identities. "But if anyone asks detailed questions about Mexican culture, let me do the talking. And if anyone asks detailed questions about Apache sign, I will handle those," Cochise replied. "Black Hawk is skilled, but he thinks like a man working for the army now. He will expect us to behave like traditional Apache fugitives." The transformation of their appearance took most of a day. Cochise cut his long braids, accepting the spiritual sacrifice with stoic dignity. Elena helped him dress in the clothes of a Mexican vaquero: white cotton shirt, leather vest, wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his distinctive features. The military bearing never completely disappeared, but casual observers would see a Mexican cowboy rather than an Apache warrior. Elena's own transformation was simpler but no less significant. She traded her adopted Apache dress for the practical clothing of a frontier woman: dark skirt, white blouse, shawl that could cover her head when needed. The ceremonial paint was washed from her face, and her hair was braided in the style of Mexican women rather than Apache. Running Wolf required the least change, since he had been living as Miguel Santos for 2 years. But Elena noticed that he moved differently now, with the confident stride of an Apache boy rather than the careful steps of an institutionalized child. That would have to change if their disguise was to be believable. "Remember," she coached him as they practiced their family interactions, "you're Miguel Santos, my adopted son. You've never been away from Santa Fe before, and you're nervous about traveling so far from home." "I understand, Mother," Running Wolf replied in perfect Spanish. "But if trouble comes, I fight like Apache. If trouble comes, we run like Apache," Cochise corrected. Fighting is the last option when outnumbered 40-3. They left Eagle's Rest Canyon before dawn on the 5th day, their few possessions packed onto horses that Cochise had acquired through trade with friendly Mexicans. Elena looked back once as they climbed out of the canyon that had sheltered her transformation, wondering if she would ever see it again. The first part of their journey took them northwest, toward the Mormon settlements in Utah Territory. It was counterintuitive. Most fugitives would head south toward Mexico, or west toward California. But Cochise reasoned that the search parties would focus on obvious escape routes, not the unlikely possibility of Apache heading into Mormon country. For 3 days, they traveled without incident. Elena began to hope that their desperate gamble might actually succeed. They looked like what they claimed to be, a small Mexican family seeking better opportunities in the American territories. Elena's improved Spanish and Cochise's natural dignity sold the deception to the few travelers they encountered. But on the 4th day, their luck ran out. They had stopped at a small trading post to buy supplies and rest their horses when Elena noticed a familiar figure across the dusty courtyard. Sergeant William Morrison, son of the cavalry officer who had led the raid on Cochise's camp, was watering his horse at the communal trough. He wore civilian clothes, but Elena recognized the military bearing and the cruel intelligence in his pale eyes. "Trouble," she murmured to Cochise in Spanish, indicating Morrison with a subtle gesture. Cochise followed her gaze and his expression hardened. "I know him. He was at the massacre. He killed my wife." Elena felt her husband's, for that's what Cochise had become in their new identities, body tense with barely controlled rage. Morrison represented everything Cochise had lost, everyone he had failed to protect. The temptation for revenge must have been overwhelming. "Carlos," she said firmly, using his assumed name and hoping it would help him maintain their cover. "We cannot afford personal battles now. Our son needs us to be smart, not brave, Running." Wolf, meanwhile, had recognized the danger from Morrison's presence and was already moving their horses closer to the trail that led away from the trading post. At 8 years old, he was displaying tactical awareness that would have impressed professional soldiers. Morrison finished watering his horse and began walking in their direction. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized he was studying their small family with professional interest. Had he recognized something familiar about Cochise despite the disguise? Had their cover already been blown? "Excuse me," Morrison said in accented Spanish as he approached. "I'm looking for information about some people who might have passed through here." A white woman traveling with an Indian and a young boy. Elena forced herself to respond naturally, channeling her inner Mexican widow. "We have seen no such people, Senator. Only honest travelers like ourselves." Morrison's eyes flicked between Elena, Cochise, and Running Wolf with the calculating attention of a predator evaluating prey. "You wouldn't happen to be headed toward California, would you? There's good money for information about these particular fugitives. We go to visit my husband's family in New Mexico," Elena replied smoothly. "Perhaps these people you seek went west instead." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Morrison continued to study them. Elena could feel sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool morning air. If he recognized any of them, if their disguises failed now, they would be captured or killed within minutes. Then Running Wolf coughed, a small sound that drew Morrison's attention. The boy looked up at the sergeant with wide, innocent eyes and spoke in perfectly accented Spanish. "Mama, can we go now? My stomach hurts from the bad water." The complaint was so perfectly childlike, so utterly normal, that it seemed to convince Morrison they were exactly what they appeared to be. He nodded curtly and walked away without another word. "Close?" Cochise murmured as they mounted their horses and rode away from the trading post. "Too close," Elena agreed. "If Morrison is here, the main search party can't be far behind." They pushed their horses harder that day, putting distance between themselves and the trading post where their cover had nearly been blown. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that their desperate flight was only postponing an inevitable confrontation. That night, as they made camp in a hidden canyon 20 miles from the trading post, Running Wolf asked the question that had been haunting all of them: "What happens if they catch us?" Elena and Cochise exchanged glances across the small fire. They both knew the answer, but neither wanted to speak it aloud in front of the boy. "They won't catch us," Elena said finally. "We're too smart, too careful, and too determined to stay together." But even as she spoke the words, she could hear the distant sound of horses moving through the night, and she wondered if their time as a family was already running out. Dawn came gray and cold over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and with it came the sound that Elena had been dreading for 6 days, the rhythmic thunder of many horses moving at military pace. She woke Cochise and Running Wolf with urgent whispers, and together they crept to the edge of their hidden camp to observe the riders approaching through the valley below. What they saw made Elena's blood turn to ice water. 43 men rode in precise formation, a mixture of U.S. cavalry in blue uniforms, Mexican federals in their distinctive gray, and civilian bounty hunters who moved with the predatory confidence of men who had never failed to bring back their quarry. At the head of the column rode 2 figures that made this personal Sergeant Morrison, and beside him on a paint horse, the Apache scout Black Hawk. "They found our trail," Cochise said grimly, studying the riders through his field glasses. "Black Hawk reads sign like poetry. He knows exactly where we are." Elena felt the crushing weight of inevitability settle on her shoulders. For 6 days, they had run like foxes before hounds, using every trick Cochise knew to obscure their passage. They had ridden through streams, doubled back on their own trail, even split up for hours at a time before reuniting at predetermined locations. But Black Hawk was reading their story in bent grass and displaced stones with the accuracy of a man who had learned tracking from the same masters as Cochise. How long do we have? She asked, though she could see the answer in the steady approach of the search party. 20 minutes, maybe less, Cochise replied. This canyon has only one exit, and they're positioning men to block it, Running Wolf, who had been scanning the rocky walls around their camp with the tactical awareness that came naturally to Apache children, suddenly pointed toward a narrow crack in the cliff face. There, he said quietly, I can fit through that gap. It leads to another canyon system. Elena looked where her son was pointing and felt her heart sink. The opening was barely wide enough for a child, certainly too narrow for adults. Running Wolf could escape, but she and Cochise would be trapped. No, she said immediately. We stay together, no matter what happens. Mother is right, Cochise agreed. Apache families do not abandon each other to save individuals. But Running Wolf was already shaking his head with the stubborn determination that marked him as both Apache and Mexican. You don't understand. I can get through the gap, circle around behind them, and create a distraction. While they're chasing me, you can escape through the main canyon. Absolutely not, Elena said with finality. You're 8 years old. I'm not sending you to face 40 armed men alone. I'm not going to face them, Running Wolf replied with patience that made him seem far older than his years. I'm going to make them chase me away from you. I know this country now. I can lose them in the high rocks and find you later. The sound of approaching horses was getting louder. Elena could hear voices now, Morrison calling orders to his men as they surrounded the canyon. In minutes, they would be trapped with nowhere to run. There is another way, Cochise said suddenly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a warrior who had made peace with necessary sacrifice. I stay and fight. You take Running Wolf and escape while they're focused on me. No, Elena and Running Wolf said simultaneously. Listen to me, Cochise continued urgently. I am already a dead man in their eyes. They will kill me whether I surrender or fight. But if I can hold their attention long enough, we are not leaving you, Elena interrupted, her voice fierce with determination. We're a family, we live together or we die together. The debate was settled by the appearance of riders at the canyon mouth. Sergeant Morrison sat his horse like a conqueror, his pale eyes scanning their small camp with satisfaction. Beside him, Black Hawk studied Cochise with the complex expression of a man looking at someone who had once been family. Cochise Windraven, Morrison called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. By the authority of the United States Army and the Mexican federal government, you are under arrest for kidnapping, harboring fugitives, and crimes against peaceful settlers. And Elena Varga, added a new voice. Father Francisco Delgado rode forward on a magnificent black stallion, his priest's robes replaced by the practical clothing of a frontier pursuer. You will return with me to Santa Fe to face charges of child endangerment and mental incompetence. Elena felt rage replace fear in her chest. The arrogance of these men, the assumption that they could dictate the shape of her family, her identity, her future, it was more than she could bear silently. My name is Sister, who chose us? She called back, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. I am Apache by choice and ceremony. This is my husband and my son, and we have committed no crimes except refusing to live according to your narrow definitions. What followed was a tense negotiation that took place. Across 30 yards of rocky ground, with 43 guns pointed at 3 people who had nowhere to run. Morrison and Father Delgado took turns making demands, offering compromises that weren't compromises at all, threatening consequences that Elena already understood too well. Be reasonable, Miss Varga, Father Delgado said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone that had driven Elena to flee Santa Fe in the first place. You're not thinking clearly. This savage has obviously coerced you into this charade. Return with me voluntarily, and I'll see that you receive proper medical treatment. I am thinking more clearly than I have in my entire life, Elena replied. And if you call my husband a savage again, priest or no priest, I'll put a bullet between your eyes." The threat was no idle bluff. Elena held Cochise's spare rifle with the confidence of someone who had learned to shoot in self-defense, and her green eyes held the kind of lethal calm that made experienced fighters step back unconsciously. Morrison tried a different approach. "Cochise, you know how this ends. You've seen what happens to Apache who resist the government's authority. Surrender now, and we'll make sure the boy isn't harmed." "The boy is my son," Cochise replied with quiet dignity. "He will not be harmed because I will not allow it." "Your son?" Morrison laughed harshly. "This is Miguel Santos, a Mexican orphan. We have documentation proving his identity." "I know who I am," Running Wolf said suddenly, his young voice cutting through the adult arguments with startling authority. "I am Running Wolf, son of Cochise Windraven and Morningstar, adopted son of sister who chose us, survivor of your massacre, and I will not go back to your mission." The simple declaration hit the assembled men like a physical blow. Here was a child who knew exactly who he was and where he belonged, despite the efforts of institutions and authorities to define his identity for him. Black Hawk, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "The boy speaks." "Truth," he said in Apache, his words meant for Cochise alone. "I remember him from the old camp. He has grown, but the spirit is the same." Cochise replied in the same language, his voice carrying both gratitude and deep sadness. "Then you know what you are helping them do, brother. You know what they took from us. I know what I lost when I chose survival over honor," Black Hawk replied heavily. "But it is too late to change paths now." The exchange in Apache seemed to shift something in the standoff. Morrison sensed that his Apache Scot was wavering, and Father Delgado grew increasingly agitated as he realized that Elena was not going to be reasoned or threatened into compliance. "Enough talking," Morrison snapped. "You have 10 seconds. To surrender, or we take you by force, Elena, Cochise." And Running Wolf moved instinctively into a defensive triangle, each covering the other's blind spots with the fluid coordination of people who had learned to function as a unit. They were outnumbered more than 14-1, trapped in a canyon with no escape route, facing professional soldiers and experienced bounty hunters. By any rational calculation, they were already dead. What happened next would be talked about around campfires and in saloons throughout the Southwest for decades to come. As Morrison raised his hand to signal the attack, the morning air was split by a sound that froze every man in the search party, the war cry of Apache warriors, echoing from the canyon walls with supernatural volume. For a moment, everyone looked around in confusion, trying to identify the source of the sound. Then the canyon exploded into chaos as 20 Apache warriors materialized from positions that had seemed empty moments before. They had been hidden in plain sight, using the broken terrain and morning shadows to achieve perfect concealment. Elena recognized the leader immediately, Nate, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache, who had been reported killed in a skirmish with Mexican troops 6 months earlier. Apparently, reports of his death had been greatly exaggerated. "Cochise Windraven," Naish called out in Apache. "Do you need assistance dealing with these trespassers on Apache land?" The psychological effect on the search party was devastating. They had come hunting 3 fugitives and suddenly found themselves outnumbered by Apache warriors who had appeared like spirits from the rocks themselves. Horses reared and men reached for weapons, but the Apache had positioned themselves with tactical precision that made resistance suicidal. "Stand down," Morrison shouted to his men, recognizing that they were outmaneuvered and outgunned despite their numerical advantage. "Nobody shoots unless I give the order," but Father Delgado, consumed by obsession and frustrated beyond reason, pulled a pistol from beneath his coat and aimed it directly at Elena. "If I can't have you, then nobody can," he snarled. The shot that followed didn't come from the priest's gun. Running Wolf's arrow took Father Delgado through the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle before he could pull the trigger. The boy had moved with Apache speed and precision, protecting his family with the same deadly accuracy his father had taught him. "Anyone else want to threaten my family?" Cochise asked conversationally, his rifle now aimed at Morrison's chest. The standoff had shifted completely. Morrison found himself staring down the barrels of 20 Apache rifles, his own men scattered and demoralized, his civilian allies questioning their commitment to a manhunt that had just become a potential massacre. "You're making a mistake," Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The U.S. government doesn't negotiate with hostiles." "Good thing we're not hostiles," Nature replied in perfect English. "We're Apache citizens defending our territory against illegal invasion. Now get off our land before we decide you're the real criminals." What followed was not the bloody battle that frontier newspapers would later claim, but something much more practical and civilized. The search party, faced with the choice between retreat and annihilation, chose retreat. Morrison gathered his wounded and his demoralized men and rode back toward Tucson, carrying the news that the Elena Varga case was officially closed due to hostile Apache interference. Father Delgado, his shoulder bound with Apache medicine that would heal cleanly but leave permanent scars, was helped onto his horse with more gentleness than he deserved. "Tell your superiors in Santa Fe that Miguel Santos died in the desert," Nate instructed him. "Tell them Elena Varga chose to become Apache rather than return to their protection." Black Hawk was the last to leave, approaching Cochise for a private conversation that took place in low, urgent Apache. Elena couldn't hear the words, but she saw forgiveness pass between the two men, a recognition that survival sometimes required choices that honor couldn't approve. "Will they come back?" Elena asked Nate as the search party disappeared into the distance. "Eventually, someone will," the war chief replied honestly, "but not soon, and not with the same confidence." "You have bought yourselves time to disappear properly," Cochise clasped his old friend's shoulder with genuine gratitude. "How did you know to find us here?" "We didn't," Nate admitted with a rare smile. "We were tracking the same search party, planning to ambush them for their weapons and horses. Finding you here was a gift from the spirits." As the Apache warriors melted back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared, Elena found herself alone with Cochise and Running Wolf in the canyon where their new life had almost ended. Before it could truly begin, "What now?" she asked, though she already knew the answer in her heart. "Now we go home," Cochise replied. "Not to Eagle's Rest Canyon, that place belongs to the past. We find new country, build a new home, raise our son to be both Apache and Mexican and American, whatever he needs to be to survive in this changing world." Running Wolf looked up at both his parents with eyes that held wisdom far beyond his. 8 years. Will it always be like this? Will we always have to run from people who want to separate us? Maybe, Elena said honestly. But we'll run together, and we'll fight together, and we'll build our family stronger every day until nobody can break what we've created. That afternoon, as they rode north toward Utah Territory and whatever future awaited them there, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from Santa Fe to this moment. She had started as Elena Varga, a lonely woman trying to build a family from fragments. She had become Sister Who Chose Us, an Apache woman who had found her place in the world through ceremony and commitment, but most importantly, she had become part of something larger than herself, a family bound not by blood or law or social convention, but by choice and love and the stubborn refusal to let the world define them according to its narrow prejudices. Behind them, Devil's Backbone Canyon settled back into the silence that had held it for centuries. The rocks remembered the confrontation, the voices, the moment when 3 people chose love over safety and family over surrender. And in the years to come, when other fugitives and outcasts found their way to that place, they would feel the presence of spirits who had once stood there and declared that some bonds were stronger than the forces that tried to break them. The desert wind carried their story in every grain of sand, in every whispered promise that families could be forged from choice as well as birth, and that love, once freely given and fiercely defended, could overcome any obstacle that prejudice and fear could devise. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled high above the canyon walls, and Elena chose to see it as a good omen, a sign that their new beginning would be blessed by the ancient spirits who watched over all those brave enough to choose their own destiny. 5 years hence, the mountain valley that Cochise, Elena, and Running Wolf had claimed as their new home bore little resemblance to the harsh desert canyon where their family had first been forged. Here, in the high country of Colorado Territory, aspen trees turned gold each autumn and snow blanketed the meadows for 4 months of the year. A small stream ran clear and cold through the center of their land, and the soil was rich enough to support both Apache corn and Mexican beans. Elena, now 32 and weathered by mountain winters, stood on the porch of the log cabin Cochise had built with his own hands, watching her son practice with weapons that would have horrified the priests of Santa Fe. Running Wolf, now 13, moved through his morning routine with the fluid grace of a born warrior, shifting seamlessly between Apache bow work and Mexican knife fighting, between the silent stalking techniques of his father's people and the horseback skills he had learned from Vezero neighbors. "He grows strong," said Maria Sandoval, the Mexican woman who had become Elena's closest friend among the scattered families who called this valley home. "But he grows different. Neither Apache nor Mexican, but something new," Elena smiled, watching Running Wolf demonstrate a complex maneuver that combined Apache stealth with Mexican blade work. "He is exactly what this country needs," she replied. "Someone who can walk between worlds without losing his soul in either." The past 5 years had been kinder to their family than the desperate flight from Arizona Territory had suggested possible. They had found sanctuary in this remote valley where the territorial authorities had little presence and the local population valued competence over pedigree. Cochise had established himself as a master tracker and guide, leading hunting parties and geological surveys through country that would have killed less experienced men. Elena had become the valley's unofficial midwife and healer, combining Apache plant medicine with Mexican folk remedies to treat ailments that baffled the few trained doctors who occasionally passed through. But it was Running Wolf who had become the real bridge between the valley's diverse communities. To the Apache families who had drifted north from the reservations, he was Cochise's son, a keeper of traditional ways. To the Mexican settlers, he was Miguel, Elena's boy who spoke perfect Spanish and understood the old customs. To the American miners and ranchers, he was simply Will, a reliable young man who could track lost cattle, interpret between languages, and handle himself in a fight. "He has made himself indispensable," Elena observed as Running Wolf finished his practice and began helping Cochise repair a fence damaged by the previous night's storm. "Everyone in the valley trusts him because he belongs to all of them and none of them." The letter that changes everything, the morning that would alter their carefully constructed life, began like any other, with Elena tending her garden while Cochise prepared for a week-long hunting expedition into the high peaks. Running Wolf was splitting firewood with the methodical precision that marked all his work, pausing occasionally to practice knife throws at a target he had carved into a nearby pine tree. The arrival of the mail rider was unusual enough to draw attention. Post came to their remote valley perhaps once a month, and usually contained nothing more significant than newspapers and supply orders. But today, the rider carried an official-looking envelope addressed to Elena Varga, also known as Sister Who Chose Us, Colorado Territory. Elena stared at the letter with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Very few people knew both her names, and fewer still knew her current location. The return address made her blood run cold. Office of Indian Affairs, Washington, D.C. Inside the envelope was a document that would have seemed like a miracle 5 years earlier, but now felt like a threat to everything they had built. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, in cooperation with the Mexican government, was offering full pardons to Elena Varga and the Indian known as Cochise, in exchange for their cooperation with a new program designed to facilitate peaceful integration between diverse frontier populations. What does it mean? Running Wolf asked, reading over Alana's shoulder with the literacy she had taught him in 3 languages. It means they want to use us, Cochise replied grimly, studying the official seals and legal language with the suspicious attention of a man who had learned not to trust government promises. They want us to become examples of their success in civilizing the frontier. Elena read further into the document, her heart sinking as the full scope of the offer became clear. They would be granted legal status, protection from prosecution, and substantial financial compensation. In return, they would relocate to a model community near Denver, where Elena would serve as a cultural liaison between Apache, Mexican, and American populations, while Cochise would train government scouts in Apache tracking techniques, and Running Wolf would attend the Carlisle Industrial School, Elena added, her voice barely above a whisper as she read the final paragraph. To receive proper education in American customs and values. The Carlisle School was infamous throughout Indian country as a place where Native children were sent to have their cultural identity systematically destroyed. Kill the Indian, save the man was their motto, and their methods were as brutal as their philosophy. They want to separate us again, Running Wolf said with calm certainty that belied his 13 years. They dress it up in pretty words, but they want to take me away from you and turn me into someone who fits their idea of what an Indian should be. Elena felt rage and fear war in her chest. After 5 years of building a life that honored all parts of their family's heritage, after proving that people from different cultures could create something beautiful together, the government wanted to dismantle everything they had achieved. In the name of proper integration, we don't have to accept, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. We're doing fine here. We don't need their pardons or their money. But do we need their protection? Cochise asked quietly. Because this letter is not just an offer. It is also a warning. They know where we are. They know who we are. And they are giving us a choice between cooperation and consequences. The wisdom of mountains that evening, as storm clouds gathered over the high peaks and the first snow of winter began to fall. The 3 members of their family held a council that would determine their future. They sat around the stone fireplace that had become the heart of their home, sharing the pipe that Cochise used for serious deliberations, speaking with the careful honesty that important decisions required. I will not go to their school, Running Wolf said first, his young voice carrying absolute conviction. I know who I am, and I will not let them take that away from me. If they try to separate us, I will run. I will disappear into the mountains and become someone they can never find. Elena felt pride and terror in equal measure. Her son had become exactly what she and Cochise had hoped, a young man with unshakable identity and fierce loyalty to family. But those same qualities would make him a target for authorities who demanded conformity above all else. And I will not train their scouts to hunt my own people, Cochise added. They want to use Apache skills to destroy Apache freedom. I would rather die than become their instrument of oppression. Elena looked at the 2 men who had become the center of her world, seeing the same stubborn courage that had brought them together in the first place. Then we refuse, she said simply. We stay here, we build our life stronger, and we face whatever consequences come. But even as she spoke the words, Elena knew they were whistling past a graveyard. The government had found them once, they could find them again. And next time, there might not be Apache warriors to intervene. No Devil's Backbone Canyon to provide tactical advantage. There is another way, Running Wolf said suddenly, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that usually preceded his most insightful observations. We accept their offer, but not their terms. Both adults looked at their son with curiosity and growing respect. Over the years, Running Wolf had developed a talent for finding third options when everyone else saw only binary choices. Explain, Cochise said seriously. We go to Denver, but not to stay, Running Wolf continued. We use their program to learn everything we can about how they operate, who they really are, what they really want. And while we're learning, we help other families like ours, families caught between cultures, people who don't fit their neat categories. Elena began to see the wisdom in her son's proposal. We become the thing they want us to be on the surface, while secretly building networks of people who understand that there are other ways to live. We subvert their program. From within, Cochise added, warming to the idea. We take their money, use their resources, and turn their integration project into something that preserves diversity instead of destroying it. The long game, the decision to accept the government's offer while secretly working to undermine its assimilationist goals required careful planning and absolute commitment to maintaining their cover identities. Elena would become the model of successful cultural integration, demonstrating how savage peoples could be civilized through proper guidance. Cochise would be the reformed warrior, using his skills in service of American expansion rather than Apache resistance. And Running Wolf would be the success story, the Indian child who had been saved from barbarism through the wisdom of American education. But beneath these carefully constructed facades, they would be building something unprecedented, a network of multicultural families who refused to sacrifice their heritage for acceptance, who chose to honor all parts of their identity rather than conform to narrow definitions of citizenship. It will be dangerous, Elena warned as they prepared for the journey to Denver. If they discover what we're really doing, if they realize we're working against their goals rather than for them, the consequences will be severe. Everything worthwhile is dangerous, Running Wolf replied with wisdom that continued to astonish his parents. The question is whether the risk is worth the potential reward. And in this case, the reward is the chance to help other families avoid the choice between cultural death and legal persecution, Cochise added. I think that is worth any risk. As they loaded their possessions into the wagon that would carry them to their new life, Elena took one last look at the mountain valley that had sheltered their family during its most vulnerable years. The aspen trees stood bare against the winter sky, their white trunks like ghostly sentinels guarding the memories they were leaving behind. Will we ever come back? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Someday, Cochise replied. When our work is finished, when other families have learned to build the bridges we have built, we will return to this place and remember how we learned to choose love over fear. Running Wolf climbed onto the wagon. Seat beside his parents, his face set with determination that made him look far older than his 13 years. And if we never come back, he said quietly, at least we'll know that we spent our lives building something that mattered. The eternal return as their wagon rolled down the mountain path that would eventually lead to Denver and whatever challenges awaited them there. Elena reflected on the journey that had brought their family to this moment. She had begun as a lonely woman seeking to build a family from fragments. She had become an Apache woman through ceremony and commitment. Now she was evolving into something new again, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of stories that proved families could be forged from choice as well as blood. Behind them, the mountain valley settled into winter silence, but it would not remain empty. Other families would find their way to this place, drawn by stories of people who had learned to honor multiple heritages without sacrificing any part of their identity. The cabin they were leaving would shelter new combinations of cultures, new definitions of family, new proof that love could overcome any obstacle that prejudice and fear could devise. Look, Running Wolf said suddenly, pointing toward the sky where a red-tailed hawk circled high above the canyon walls. Elena smiled, remembering the first time she had seen such a hawk. Years ago in a different canyon when their family was just beginning to form. A good omen, she said, as she had then. The same hawk? Cochise asked with the hint of a smile that suggested he understood the deeper meaning of the question. The same spirit, Elena replied. Watching over all the families who choose to build bridges instead of walls, who refuse to let the world define them according to its narrow prejudices. The hawk soared higher as they watched, its cry echoing off the mountain peaks like a promise that some bonds could never be broken, that love freely given and fiercely defended could survive any challenge, that families forged in choice and ceremony would endure long after the forces that tried to destroy them had turned to dust. In the distance, Denver waited with its promises and threats, its opportunities and dangers. But Elena faced that future without fear, secure in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together, as Apache and Mexican and American, as chosen family stronger than blood, as living proof that the human heart could expand. To hold infinite love without losing its essential identity, the wagon wheels turned steadily on the mountain path, carrying 3 people toward whatever destiny awaited them, while behind them, the eternal mountains kept their secrets and their promises, witness to the truth that love, once freely chosen, could transform the world one family at a time.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.